Welcome D&D players far and wide, thank you for stopping by. Since the 80s, game developers have been trying to turn D&D into a video game. Usually, then TSR, or now Wizards of the Coast, breaks up a small part of the D&D lore and gives it to a developer. This is how we get games like Baldur's Gate, Planescape Torment, or Neverwinter. And that's not to mention the plethora of games from Ultima to Pillars of Eternity that take heavy inspiration from Dungeons & Dragons. But here's the question of the video. Should these game developers continue to try and replicate Dungeons & Dragons in video games? Hey, quick note before the video starts, 99% of the people who watch my videos are not subscribed. As a small video creator, this sucks because it means the algorithm buries my videos. So, if you could, like, comment, and subscribe if you really want to help this channel. Hope you like the video, here we go. Now let's break this down a little bit. There are many video games that, while they relate to D&D, don't attempt to recreate the game. They're obviously doing their own thing. Now this is all well and good. A game such as Tyranny, while borrowing from D&D, is definitely its own distinct IP and product. On the other hand, you get a game like D&D Dark Alliance, which is another game obviously doing its own thing, but it's also borrowing heavily from the name, the lore, and at least the names of things within the tabletop game. Yet, when you play Dark Alliance, it is nothing like D&D. That has led to some mixed reviews. Don't get me wrong, if Dark Alliance was a really good game, I don't think there'd be a problem. However, in the past, bad games have held D&D back from really stepping into the public eye. With D&D bigger than ever, I think it's time to either figure out D&D games, or for Wizards of the Coast to protect their IP, which is doing so well. Let's talk about the history of official D&D licensed games for the scope of this video. D&D has influenced a lot of video games, but there are just too many to consider. So, what do we see when we look at official D&D licensed games and DLC? Here is a list of those games. See a pattern? Most of these games are failures. For every successful Baldur's Gate, you get 5 Dark Alliances or Pathfinder Kingmakers. Bad, mediocre, or heavily flawed titles litter this list. It's quite frankly incredible that there have been so many failures. Additionally, D&D fans can be hard on these games and are quick to write them off. So, why do developers keep returning to this well? Let's go over the pros of creating a video game using the Dungeons & Dragons IP. Point 1. Nostalgia. Lots of these games are created by people who have a love for Dungeons & Dragons. But that's not enough to keep greenlighting games. Point 2. Built-in fanbase. At least some people will buy the game no matter the state it's in. Additionally, some will even defend the game, and publishers are counting on that. Point 3. Visuals. D&D fans want to see the things they've imagined come to life. It's why making movies off books works so well. There's just something different about seeing a beholder on screen. I think that the visuals of a video game are one of the biggest selling points for a D&D game. And I'm not talking about graphical fidelity or the detail of the models. Just the act of seeing something is enough. D&D players have big imaginations to start off. They tend to make the monsters they're fighting better in their heads. So while graphics are good, and let's be honest here, making a D&D game with amazing models and shading would definitely be a bonus, there simply needs to be something there. Point 4. Professional quality. Not everyone has access to a great DM. Just check out some of the horror stories players have online. A video game is brought to the player by a team of professionals. There are professional writers, professional designers, and professional artists. Thus, a player can expect a certain baseline standard. That's in and of itself appealing to many. And finally, point 5, portable D&D. There are so many different reasons why a person isn't able to join a D&D campaign. Scheduling, technological limitations, and social anxiety being a few of the major ones. Being able to sit down and play D&D on your own time, when you're free, and for however long you want is tremendous. Getting lost in an RPG is a fantastic experience, and video games can offer that. Combine this with the freedom and storytelling potential of Dungeons & Dragons, and you have something special. But the public hasn't gotten that game. Why? Now we move into the cons of producing a D&D video game. Point 1. Bad mechanics. It's hard, if not impossible, to replicate Dungeons & Dragons. You are only limited by your imagination on the tabletop, and you're limited by the code in a video game. This leads to one of two things. The first being that the developer tries to add too many mechanics without having the resources to polish their game. Then, come launch, the game is half finished. Or, the second option is that choice is removed and the mechanics the developer can manage are polished. However, during game launch, the experience isn't even close to the tabletop. The player is limited and the freedom is removed. You can't possibly win. Point 2. Bugs. Another issue that stems from developers reaching too far. D&D is a game where you can go anywhere and do anything. In reality, it's usually limited to an area that the dungeon master has prepared, but still, lots of freedom. When developers attempt to provide massive maps, long branching dialogue trees, and dynamic worlds, bugs begin to creep in. Many D&D video games are riddled with bugs at launch, and that kills the game. By the time those bugs are fixed, players move on, and you get another title with so much wasted potential that becomes a market failure. Point 3. Limited story. This is simple enough that I don't think any of you need a long explanation. Video games have story trees. They are confined to a few separate routes, not tabletop games. As a DM, I've got no clue how my adventure will end. Anything can happen. It's one of the most exciting parts of the game, in my opinion, so bumping into an invisible story wall in a game sucks. Routinely in video games, there are plans I would love to execute, but then I realize that I cannot. The game won't allow me. It won't allow what makes up D&D's magic. Point 4. Lack of creative freedom. Homebrew is a big part of many D&D games. Every gaming group I've been a part of has their own unique rules, spells, abilities, and more. In a video game where everything is preset, you as a player cannot add anything. I cannot easily add a new spell or mechanic to Baldur's Gate 2. This symbiotic relationship that players have with the game is cut. The game cannot mold around its players anymore. It comes in a one-size-fits-all package that doesn't fit anyone perfectly. And I want to note here that these are cons specifically for a D&D game. Most of these cons are just how video games work in the industry. However, they are the Achilles heel of creating a D&D game because these things are fantasies that D&D provides its players and that players come to expect. You wouldn't complain about a limited narrative path in a shooter. It is just the same that you wouldn't complain about weapon attachments in a D&D game. They're two completely different genres of game, and so they have different standards. I am just talking about D&D game standards. So, what have we learned? Well, I think we can rightly acknowledge that a lot of problems with a D&D video game stem from one thing. Video game companies are limited. They can't just snap their fingers and make things happen. A AAA gaming company employs designers, computer programmers, animators, audio engineers, writers, 3D modelers, game testers, producers, and literally dozens more different jobs. The making of even a single character or mechanic or anything takes time, resources, and money. If a game company had unlimited time, employees, and money, then of course they could fix all the problems that I'm posing, but they don't have those things. Even big studios like Larian can't produce everything despite all the options they provide in their RPGs. I am personally a huge fan of Divinity 1 and 2, but I even acknowledge that it's technically a poor port of the tabletop experience. So that's it, right? That's the answer to our question? We shouldn't even try to make a D&D video game? No, we can make a good D&D video game that fulfills the core fantasy. Tricked you, right? Well, probably not. There's still a lot of time left in this video. Okay, moving on, back on track. There's already a game that does capture the fantasy of D&D. So, I bet you're thinking Skyrim. Well, you're close. Skyrim has a lot of things we love about D&D. Freedom, a branching story, a huge world, and it overcame a lot of bugs. Well, yes, the game does have all those things, but that's not why it's like D&D. In fact, it was Nintendo that figured out the formula. Again, not with a game like Breath of the Wild. That too is close, but there's one game that captures what a D&D game can be. Are you ready? Super Mario Maker is the best template for how to make a D&D game. No, let me explain. It is the consumer who makes the levels in Super Mario Maker. Through what is essentially a robust modding system, players can create their own Mario levels. Why is Skyrim so relevant today? Well, releases from Todd Howard aside, mods. New mods for Skyrim are released all the time and keep the game fresh. Let me paint you a picture of what this Dungeons & Dragons Maker game can be. When you buy the game and you boot it up, a map is already provided of an open world. It probably mirrors or is just the Sword Coast. The game also ships with a main story. I would personally love to have the game retell Lost Mine of Phandelver. It is the classic starting adventure and does a good job introducing the players to D&D. There would also be side quests as well. These side quests would be scattered around the map and can show off mechanics that are in the game to get players thinking about their own designs. But what then, when you finish off the limited shipped content? Well, that's the beauty of it. Having a robust modding system would allow players to create all sorts of things for their game. Players could create and download each other's new items, spells, dungeons, and even entire quest lines. With the community having access to modding tools, we can reintroduce D&D's creative freedom into video games. The actual modding tools would probably be a mix of Mario Maker, Skyrim's creation kit, and the simplicity of something like RPG Maker. The video game, like Dungeons & Dragons, would be made by the community just like always. Creators could go as big or small as they wanted. By embracing the modding community, a D&D game could be so much bigger than any one company could make. Allow the development team to focus on bugs and new features for the modding tools over the course of the game's lifespan. That way, the community can thrive over many years and grow. It's much easier to release a DLC of new celestial monsters than a new 10-hour story quest. Plus, those new monsters could result in 1,000 hours of new quests due to the community's use of them. A game company can get around their limited resources by outsourcing to the fandom itself. Finally, here are some features that I personally would want to see in a game like this. First, a Witcher-esque dialogue system. There is a great GDC video here that explains the phenomenal tools that CD Projekt Red used to create the dialogue system in The Witcher 3. Such a system already exists, to a lesser degree, in the Skyrim Creation Kit. I'd say improving the UI for the average person is all that really needs to be done to give players a powerful tool for creating great dialogue. Using this type of tool, I can easily see a full story reminiscent of the late Telltale games being created even. With the improvements of text-to-speech technology, it could also be possible to have the dialogue voiced. I mean, comparatively badly to an actual voice actor, but theoretically could still be done. Second, the ability to roll your own dice. One of the great joys of D&D is dice rolling. I'd like an option to toggle on and off where the player can input their random die roll. Lots of times players complain about online dice rollers, and the same thing happens with D&D video games. Let's give people the opportunity to use a real die roll in front of them and let it affect their game. Now, some people might ask about player cheating. Couldn't someone just input a 20 for everything? And the answer is yes, obviously they could. But you could also cheat in the video game as well. People do it all the time. Heck, if a player wants to remove all challenge from a game, let them. I know that many more players will be happier rolling their own dice. And last, but certainly not least, release 5e adventures in the D&D game. Either a third party or the actual game development company itself could release different 5e adventures in their own game. I think this would naturally happen anyway with the modding tools, so why not make it official? Adventures like Curse of Strahd that are away from the Sword Coast would be difficult. However, things like Dungeon of the Mad Mage, Rise of Tiamat, and Storm King's Thunder could, in reality, fit into a video game really well. I'd love playing out these stories in game form. So, what's the answer to our question? Should D&D be a video game? Yes, absolutely the game should be adapted to this medium. It provides so many benefits. However, in my opinion, most game companies are going about creating a D&D game the wrong way. A D&D game should put the emphasis on the community to make content. I think that this is the way to help extract the juice that makes tabletop games amazing. Will this happen? Well, who knows? Share this video with anyone who is interested. Let's get them talking about what we want to see from a D&D video game to help give the industry ideas. Let them hear our voices. By the time I die, I want to see a AAA D&D licensed video game win Game of the Year. And I think we're well on our way to getting there with the popularity of D&D today. Should Dungeons & Dragons be a video game? Yes. Despite all the failures and missteps of the past, there have been some great games, and I look forward to seeing many more great titles in the future. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much. Please tell me in the comments, what do you think? Is my idea for a D&D video game like Super Mario Maker crazy? How would you make a D&D video game if you could? I want to hear your thoughts. If you want more content like this, maybe subscribe? I'm a small channel and I do want to grow. And also, thank you for entering the dungeon.